Welcome to another episode of Seeds of Tomorrow. Today's topic is innovation in plant breeding. And to discuss this topic, we invited Petra Jorasch. Petra holds a PhD in plant molecular biology from the University of Hamburg, and she's been with Euroseeds since 2017. Good morning, Petra.
Good morning.
In studio with us, we have Nuria Urquía, Vice President of the CPVO. Good morning, Nuria.
Good morning, Alessio, and good morning, Petra. Good morning, colleagues.
And Dirk Theobald, Senior Advisor at the CPVO.
Good morning to everyone. Hello, Petra. Hello, Nuria.
Petra, could you explain to our listeners what is the role that Euroseeds play in advocating for innovation in plant breeding?
Sure, thanks a lot. Yes, Euroseeds is representing the European seed and breeding sector, and my own role in Euroseeds is Manager Plant Breeding Innovation Advocacy. So I take care of all the topics related to plant breeding innovation and specifically the new breeding techniques or new genomic techniques as they are called. And we are trying to advocate for the interests of the European seed and breeding sector in innovation, of course, but also in many other topics. So we are actually representing the interests of the European seed and breeding sector in all types of relevant topics for the European seed and breeding sector.
Okay, thank you, Petra. And perhaps you could, to start with this conversation, you could perhaps provide us with an overview on the current state of innovation in plant breeding.
Yeah, the current state of innovation in plant breeding is, I always try to refer to like an evolution, because I mean, we are now talking about what we call new genomic techniques or new breeding techniques, but in fact, of course, plant breeding has been innovating always. So also like for the past 150 years after the laws of genetics have been discovered by Gregory Mendel. So since then, plant breeders, of course, have tried to innovate and to make plant breeding more efficient. And what we are currently discussing as the so-called new breeding techniques are, let's say, the latest steps in this kind of evolution of technologies, which have been developed over these past, let's say, couple of decades. I'd say 10 to 15 years, there are new methods that have been developed, and these methods are making plant breeding even more efficient and specifically more targeted. So plant breeders are interested in introducing genetic diversity. And this genetic diversity can be natural genetic diversity, which they find somewhere in the fields or within their germplasm, but it can also be induced genetic diversity. And what plant breeders did like over the past 100 years is introducing genetic diversity, but very randomly. So there was no way to introduce it in a direct or targeted manner. And those new technologies, which we are currently discussing, like genome editing, CRISPR-Cas, they actually can be used to introduce genetic diversity in a specific place in the plant genome. So very, very targeted. And that's, of course, something which I think plant breeders always dreamed of having such a tool available. And now this is actually possible. And that, of course, helps saving time during the breeding process, but also it helps saving costs in a sense that you don't need to screen thousands of different plants for a specific genetic change, but you can really reduce this to a couple of plants, which in the end, of course, saves also costs in the process of plant breeding.
Yes, you mentioned costs, but also certainly time. I think,
yes,
from your perspective, does these techniques contribute to an acceleration of plant breeding compared to previous years?
Yes, indeed. Of course, time is a very important issue here. So let's assume if a plant breeder wanted to introduce a certain characteristic in its new germplasm by crossbreeding, then he had to backcross several times for several years in order to let's say, isolate the specific characteristic from all the genetic background that is also transferred if you do crossbreeding. And what they can do now is specifically introduce that new characteristic, and then you don't need all these back crossbreeding steps. So that means you reduce the breeding time. And so what I have heard, depending of course also on the crop, because if you breed a crop like maize, it's in total a shorter breeding time compared, for example, to a crop like cereals or potatoes. But what I heard is that it can be reduced by around 30%. So that's the estimate, which is currently floating around. So that means, of course, time, but also costs in a sense, because you can be earlier on the market. So that also gets you a higher return on investment and allows you to adapt plant varieties also quicker to certain, let's say, challenges like new pests and diseases, etc.
Yeah, this is of course a very important aspect, in particular when we look at the issues which are at stake at the moment, like global food security and climate change. How do you see that? Can these breeding techniques, these new breeding techniques, contribute effectively to these challenges?
Yes, they can. That's a very short answer, of course, but I mean, maybe just context-wise, I would say, I mean, these breeding techniques are new tools in the breeder's toolbox, but they do not really change the goals that a breeder has. So breeding is always about specifically increasing productivity, adapting plants to new environmental challenges, climate change, new pests and diseases, but also, of course, having better qualities. So that's the objective of plant breeding, and that doesn't change just by having the new tools. So, in fact, yes, those new tools can also address those breeding goals and help to achieve them. And as I said, they can help to achieve them in a more targeted and a more efficient manner. So in that sense, they can hopefully, if we have the right regulatory framework around that, they can hopefully also contribute to achieving certain goals in a more targeted and more efficient way. So as I already mentioned, so for example, adapting plant varieties to withstand new pests and diseases, so that, for example, spraying in agriculture can be reduced and those types of elements. But of course, the same is true for better qualities, drought resistance, so abiotic and biotic stresses which affect plants, but then also increasing yields by making plants more efficient in nutrient use efficiency or water use efficiency. So that can all be addressed by those technologies, and hopefully they can help to achieve those goals in a faster way.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive, Petra. I wanted to ask you, I mean, talking about all these new technologies and the impacts that they are having in plant breeding. You're talking about shortening the breeding periods. You're talking about more targeted objectives and, in a way, less disruption, let's say, of the natural genome. But do you think that these technologies are changing radically the scenarios of plant breeding now? Do you think that we are already there, this radical transformation?
That depends, I would say, because it's not only depending on the technology and its availability, it's also depending on the regulatory framework which we have around us. So currently, those technologies are regulated as GM technology, so genetic modification in the European Union. Since this regulatory framework is a very burdensome framework, it's actually the technologies are not applied for practical plant breeding at the moment. So we hope to see a change in the regulation, and then I would say if regulation changes and if it becomes more feasible for breeders to use the technology in practice, then we will definitely see the application of those technologies, and we assume that they will also be widely used in breeding. Definitely also here, depending a bit on the crop. So there are crops which are probably more advanced than other crops. But even for those crops which are maybe also underused in breeding, like orphan crops, minor crops, also for those crops, those technologies provide an opportunity because they can maybe keep up with other breeding, with other crops which are like where there are higher investments in breeding more easily if those technologies would be available.
Just following up on what you just said, and let's assume that the regulatory framework will allow to use also in the EU in the future these technologies in a more smart way. From your perspective, do you expect that there will be also changes in the landscape of the breeders, meaning that there are perhaps new players appearing in the breeding sector?
Definitely, we can already see that that there are new companies popping up, let's say, who are more into technology development, into trade development, and who might build a business a bit different from, let's say, the classical breeding company in either providing services for breeders, so helping breeders to apply the technology, or by developing specific characteristics, so-called traits, and out licensing those to breeding companies that would be interested in using those traits. So we already see that, not only specifically in Europe, because we still have this challenging regulatory situation, but we see that in other countries already. So there are new opportunities for new players in the, let's say, seed sector.
Yeah, and then beside those challenges, would you see we talk about all these advantages, but what about the public concerns? I mean, we cannot ignore that there is still some rejection in this kind of technologies for some part of the population that's not wide pipe, but there is still some concern. And how do you address these public concerns about modern plant breeding technologies?
Sure, there is certain concerns because it's a new technology, and people also might have a limited understanding for the moment because it's not something which is touchable. We don't have products on the market, so that means we have many, let's say, theoretical discussions, but nothing which is tangible also for the consumer. So I mean, with any type of new technologies, I don't expect that everybody would in the end agree and be happy. So we would need to still have like the freedom of choice for those who might not want to use those technologies or consume products of those technologies. And I think that is feasible because we will have like the choice for farmers to either grow or not grow those type of crops. And then you would have probably specific value chains for people who do not like those products. But then also, I think there will be a chance to convince people also by also explaining the benefits of those products when it comes, for example, to more sustainable agricultural practices, by reducing the use of pesticides, or by having, I don't know, for example, a low gluten wheat, which would facilitate people who have certain allergies, food allergies or intolerances. So by really highlighting the benefits that those products can bring to people. And I think once we would have practical examples also in the supermarket, this can be better explained than just talking about options and potentials, but not having a tangible product yet available. But I fully agree. So it requires more explanation, more education, but also not only for new technologies, because if you have the same experience when talking to friends and family, about plant breeding as such. Many people are not aware that there is a sector that is doing plant breeding. So, and many people would ask, so why do we need this? We have wheat, we have oilseed rape or sugar beet, and explaining also the context in which those technologies are applied, I think is very important in order to bring certain messages, but also certain reality into the discussion.
Yeah, and there's also an element that we cannot ignore, which is the economical impact, not only for the breeding sector, but also for the consumer, because we will have a wider offer, I guess. So can you please elaborate a little bit on these economic implications of these new breeding techniques?
Sure. Maybe we can also have a look, let's say, into the past in order to do some to provide some perspective for the future. So we did a study a few years ago, and this study was an economic study on the impact of plant breeding for society. And this study did the assumption, so if we wouldn't have had plant breeding for the past 20 years, what actually would that have what actually would have been the impact of that for agricultural productivity? And so the study made clear that already today around 66% of the productivity gain in agriculture is going back to plant breeding, so genetic improvement, which means if we wouldn't have had plant breeding, for example, we would have had to have additional land in order to produce the same amount of agricultural output in the European Union. And they calculated it and they said it would be 22 million additional hectares of land that would have been needed in order to compensate for the production loss without plant breeding. And that's the size of Romania, actually. So, which just means we need additional land. We would need additional land, which would be not available also for nature conservation, for example. So there are many, let's say, impacts of plant breeding that also need to be communicated probably better in order to show that the value of plant breeding actually for society. And of course, if you have less productivity, then you would also have higher prices, for example. You could have all these kind of impacts also on, for example, for farmers, their business, their income, etc. So there are many different effects that plant breeding in the end has on their customers, so the farmers, but also on the wider society up to the consumer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, indeed.
On imports, I guess, right? Yeah.
I mean, it listening to you and also to the general discussion and the concerns in the public, it brings us almost to a situation that this discussion we have now on one hand on the new technologies, and on the other hand the issues at stake, the societal issues at stake, that this offers for an association like Euroseeds and for the breeding community also an opportunity to communicate what might be possible with applying these new technologies in order to contribute, not to solve issues which are under discussion, environmental issues or climate change, but at least to contribute effectively to find solutions in order to cope with these challenges. How do you see that?
Yeah, definitely. It's an opportunity to have a conversation like we have today. So also with the wider public about breeding and the impacts of breeding, and also to provide examples. I mean, for the time being, these examples are not in practice, but at least we can do some assumptions. For example, we did a calculation. If we would have a wheat, for example, as one of the major crops here in Europe, and we would have a wheat which is more resistant against fungi, and this wheat would not need to be sprayed for 1 or 2 times, or it wouldn't need to be sprayed like the normal wheat. So we would have, for example, 2 applications less in pesticide use, that would mean we could save up to 25 million applications alone in wheat in Europe. So that's a high number, and this also only if we would plant this wheat in 50% of the acreage. If it would be 100%, it would be even more. So that just shows that there is an opportunity, and we also had the nice example of grape wines. I mean, grape wines are only produced on 3% of the EU agricultural area, but they use 60% of the fungicides which are applied in Europe. So huge applications of fungicides. So if we could develop a grape wine that is resistant, of course, that would have a huge impact on our sustainability goals in European agriculture. So yeah, there are lots of opportunities and lots of opportunities also to communicate about that. Yes.
Yeah, let me just come back a little bit to the policy environment that you were talking about, the regulatory framework. You say that currently, which is the fact, it is true, the NGTs are treated as GMOs. But why do you think NGTs should not be considered as GMOs? Are we in the right track in terms of regulatory frameworks in Europe, in the way things are going?
Yes. So why shouldn't they be regulated as GMOs? I wouldn't say all of them should not be regulated as GMOs, but NGTs are different in the sense that they can result in products which are indistinguishable from products that can also be developed by conventional breeding. And for those types of products, I think we need a different regulatory framework, and that was also confirmed by the study that has been done by the European Commission, because those products are actually not identifiable as regulated GMOs. So if you have a product that is not identifiable as a regulated product, so you run, of course, into all kinds of issues regarding enforcement, regarding control of the market, specifically in the case of NGTs, because many other countries, which are major trading partners to the EU, also do not regulate those products as GMOs. So meaning they are on the market in those countries as conventional products, and they will be, of course, traded also on international level. And if we as European Union decide to continue to regulate them as GMOs, we would run into enforcement issues. So member states who are responsible for enforcement would not be able to identify those products, for example, in huge ships that come into our harbors, and then we are in a difficult situation. That's the enforcement part. But on the other hand, I think also the European Commission and many other stakeholders are aware that those technologies are an opportunity for Europe also to achieve the sustainability goals which we have set for European agriculture. So there are, let's say, two aspects. One is the aspect talking about the benefits of those products, and they can only realize if we have an enabling regulatory framework. The current GMO framework did not lead to any GM cultivation in Europe, just to imports. And if we want to make use of those benefits, we need another regulatory framework. And then, of course, in addition, the enforcement issues.
Yeah, very interesting. And of course, we are talking about innovation. And if we talk about innovation, we also have to speak about intellectual property protection. And as we all know, for plant varieties as such, we have a system, the Plant Breeders' Rights System, which is supposed to support innovation in plant breeding and to create incentives. How do you see the PBR system also having in mind the upcoming of new technologies?
Yeah, from our perspective, the plant variety protection system is still let's say, the major IP protection system for plant varieties in Europe. And I think everybody knows the value of that system, including the breeders' exemption, which allows breeders to have access to the material to further build innovation. So that's for sure. There are definitely some questions specifically around this concept of essentially derived varieties. So if somebody would use a variety and just add, for example, a certain characteristic, is this still in the scope of the protection of the original breeder, or is it outside? So these types of questions are, of course, relevant and they need to be clarified. But yeah, so that's I think maybe a normal discussion that you have if new technologies and new products come up, and also new business concepts. I mean, we also have the discussion around the other intellectual property right, which is patents. And there's also a huge political discussion around that. But there is, of course, also an economic discussion, which is we have new business concept, as I already explained. And of course, those companies also have an interest in protecting their intellectual property, which might not be a variety, but something else, a technology or a characteristic. So how can we find a system which kind of outbalances the different interests and still allows for further innovation in the sector, which is of course needed. So if we would have an intellectual property system that counteracts what we actually want to achieve, that is innovation, then we are not on the right track. So finding this balance, I think, is very crucial in order to allow this innovation to become a reality. So regulatory is one important aspect, but of course, the balanced IP system is very important here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, in relation to this, I would say, I mean, it's in the minds of everyone. I mean, the recent opinion of the Parliament on the regulatory framework, the proposal that is being discussed on new NGTs, and their opinion thinking that there should be a ban on patents regarding NGTs. So what do you think about that? I mean, is that the solution?
You probably know that this is also a very challenging discussion within the seed sector. We have also companies and national associations which have a critical view on patents on conventional like NGT varieties, while others say, well, we need this because we need to get a return on investment also on all our research investments. So it's a challenging discussion, and as I said, we need to find the right balance here. And so the Commission announced also in the context of the publication of the proposal that they will conduct a study on the impact of intellectual property rights, specifically patents, on innovation, on certain players in the breeding sector, in order to also probably come up with a proposal, a legal proposal, if they find certain issues. So probably, and you have seen maybe also our statement. So that's the right way to go to do an assessment and to really see where is the impact and what needs to be done in order to readjust, let's say, the balance in the IP system if needed. So that's an ongoing discussion with different positions. The Parliament position is one position. The Commission has proposed a study. From the Council, I think we have seen that they also support a study, maybe even in like a shorter timeline. So ongoing, and yeah, we need to see where this ends in the end. But definitely something that needs to be addressed.
The important thing in balancing, when we talk about balancing on the patent system and the PBR system, is of course, you mentioned it earlier, the breeder's privilege and the access to material for further breeding. I think this is the core part of the IP system when we talk about plant breeding.
Yeah, and not only, I think it's also the fact that we need a way of promoting innovation in NGTs, because of course, if you don't allow patents, then the molecular biology breeders, let's say, will not find an innovation motivation, let's say, an incentive. But at the same time, we need to find this balance, so maybe, going through patenting the methodologies, but not the final product, not the final plants itself.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to really find the balance between both systems. And, and we know that the PBR system has been successful for the last 50 years, so what should not be now?
Yeah. I think, I mean, there are two elements, and one is, of course, the question, should it be patentable or not? The other question, which is relevant in this context, is let's assume there are patents, and there are already patents, not only on new genomic techniques, but we also know that there's, of course, patents on conventional breeding, including classical mutagenesis. So how do we handle those patents? And of course, can patents be used to create monopolies, or would the patent owner be forced to provide licenses? Are there ways to find, for example, facilitate licensing under fair and reasonable conditions, like licensing platforms, and all these elements also feed into the discussion. So it's not only about asking, should there be a patent or not, but it's also be a question, if there is a patent, how should that be handled, and how should access be facilitated in order to also allow those who might not be the IP owners having access under fair and reasonable conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. They have been coexisted in the last 50 years, and they should coexist now. And so they're just trying to finalize this very interesting podcast. What do you think are the future trends? Where are we going from here in plant breeding?
Maybe I can refer also to, let's say, the international environment in which we are acting. I mean, Europe is not an island. So I mentioned already international trade, but when we look at our global map, how regulations are developing, we can see a clear trend. And the trend is differentiating regulations and differentiating those types of plants which result from new genomic techniques and which are indistinguishable from conventional breeding as conventional. So meaning there's a clear trend in countries to regulate them different from GMOs. And we can see that in those countries where those new regulations have been established, there are new business opportunities. There are already a few products on the market. So I think, it creates new opportunities. It creates opportunities for breeders, new types of companies, but also, of course, and that's more important for farmers in the end, to have better products that they can put in their fields in order to cope with all the challenges that they are facing.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Petra. And then just for young scientists that might be listening to us, what do you think, what advice would you give them if they are interested in pursuing a career in plant breeding?
Well, what kind of advice? Yeah, be interested, join our sector. It's just a very interesting business. It provides lots of opportunities, and to be honest, so I'm a molecular biologist. I'm not a plant breeder, but I think in the plant breeding is kind of bringing together very different sectors in science. So it's not only breeding, it's molecular biology, it's phenotyping, it's bioinformatics, it's all these different perspectives coming together and contributing to plant breeding. So it's a very interesting sector, and so also very diverse, many different types of companies. So a very interesting business to work for.
Thank you very much, Petra. It was extremely interesting to me. I don't know what you think, Dirk.
Thank you. Same for me. Thank you, Petra. It was very, very enlightening talk to you today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we'll see you then. Bye-bye, Petra.
Bye.
And this concludes our episode today. A big thank you to our guests and to our listeners. Keep following us on the socials to stay updated on the latest episodes. This is Alessio De Laurentiis signing off. The music you're listening to is from Jazzcopo, a Lombardi and Amoruso production.